A warrior, captured in a foreign land, kneels, feeling the cold sand seep through his skin. The battle is lost, his shield shattered, his sword gone. Before him stands a Viking chieftain whose father he killed in the chaos of a raid. In the chieftain's eyes is not just anger, but a deep, chilling thirst for vengeance, promising suffering that will be sung of in legends for millennia. His goal is not merely the prisoner's death, but to transform him into a terrifying message. This is the Viking Age, a period from the late 8th to the late 11th century, an era of long ships, heroic voyages, and sagas of gods and heroes. Yet, behind the image of fearless seafarers and noble warriors lay a brutal reality, governed by a code of honor and vengeance capable of unimaginable cruelty. This wasn't about random acts of savagery, but part of a system of beliefs and retribution, a form of psychological warfare so extreme that historians have debated its true nature for centuries. The information you're about to learn is drawn from Norse sagas and skaldic poetry, as well as from the research of archaeologists and scholars striving to separate myth from terrifying truth. Administrative records of victims and modern anatomical studies paint a grim picture of a ritualized instrument of vengeance known as the blood eagle, a practice so monstrous it seems to belong to mythology. The blood eagle ritual was not merely an execution, but a deeply symbolic and religious ceremony, a sacrifice to Odin, the god of war and death. It was reserved for the most hated enemies, those who had committed unforgivable offenses against an influential family, typically the murder of a father or chieftain. The ritual's purpose was twofold: to inflict maximum suffering upon the victim and to create a horrifying spectacle that would forever cement the executioner's reputation. The process, as described in Norse literature, is striking in its clinical detail. The victim would be immobilized, tied to a stake, or laid face down on the ground, and then the outline of eagle's wings would be carved into their back. The executioner, using a knife or sword, would make deep incisions into the flesh, cutting through layers of muscle. But this was only the beginning. The true horror lay in the next step. Ribs, one by one, would be severed from the spine and pulled outwards, forming a gruesome pair of bloody wings. The final act was the most horrific. Through the gaping wound in the victim's back, the lungs would be pulled out. According to poetic descriptions, the victim, if still alive, would experience their last breaths as the fluttering of exposed lungs, resembling the beating of wings. Salt would then be sprinkled into the wound. This was an execution designed to erase a person from existence in the most agonizing way, turning their body into a monument to their own destruction. It was the ultimate expression of power, a statement that the executioner's vengeance was so absolute it could deconstruct a human being. But who deserved such a fate? The sagas name specific victims, kings and powerful chieftains whose deaths demanded an equally potent response. The most famous story involves the legendary Viking hero Ragnar Lodbrok. According to the sagas, Ragnar was captured by Illa, king of Northumbria, and executed in a snake pit. Ragnar's sons, including Ivar the Boneless and Bjorn Ironside, swore vengeance. They gathered an army, invaded England, and capturing King Alla, subjected him to the blood eagle. The Saga of Ragnar's Sons, written in the 13th century, describes this directly. They carved the blood eagle on his back. In this context, the eagle was not just a symbol of brutality, but a direct symbolic response. Ella used snakes to kill their father, so they used the eagle to destroy him. Another description appears in the Orkney-Inga saga, which recounts the feud between the sons of Harald Fairhair, the king of Norway. Halfdan Longleg had killed Rognvaldr Eysteinsson, the Earl of Mør, an ally of the king. In retaliation, Rognvaldr's son, Thorfinn, captured Halfdan. The saga gives a chilling account. Hinar's men held Halfdan while Einar carried out the execution. The saga states, "He carved the blood eagle on his back, putting a sword to the spine and cutting all the ribs from the backbone down to the loins and then pulling out the lungs," adding that Einar dedicated his victim to Odin as an offering for his victory. These stories and other ambiguous mentions form the body of written evidence, consistent in their narrative, a grave insult, a vow of vengeance, and a ritualistic execution in the form of an eagle dedicated to the supreme god of the Norse. For centuries, these accounts were accepted as proof of Viking barbarity. However, modern history is a science of skepticism. As historians began to scrutinize the documentation, a debate erupted over whether the blood eagle ever truly existed. This leads to historical contention. On one side are scholars who argue that the blood eagle is a myth, a literary invention born of misunderstanding. The most influential proponent of this theory was Roberta Frank, who contended that Christian authors, writing centuries after the Viking Age and eager to portray the pagan Norse as monstrous, misinterpreted Old Norse poetry. The key phrase, "carve an eagle on the back," in her view, was a poetic metaphor known as a kenning and did not signify a literal surgical procedure, but merely killing an enemy in battle and leaving their corpse on the field for birds to tear apart with talons and beak. In this interpretation, the carving was done by the eagle's talons, not a human knife. The vivid details found in later sagas were embellishments that grew over time, each retelling adding a more horrifying layer. Historian Frank emphasizes that early mentions of the ritual are extremely vague, while the most vivid and detailed descriptions come from later Christian sources. Notably, there is a lack of archaeological confirmation. Viking burials, battlefields, and settlements have been discovered, along with skeletons bearing clear marks of brutal combat. However, no skeleton has been found with ribs severed from the spine as described in the sagas. Many historians find this absence of physical evidence and the poetic ambiguity of early sources dubious. In their view, the blood eagle was a powerful tool of anti-pagan propaganda and a sinister literary image, rather than a real historical practice. However, the debate does not end there. Other historians argue that a complete denial of the blood eagle ignores the context in which these stories were created. They contend that the descriptions, especially in Thorfinn's case, are too specific and clinically precise to be merely metaphorical. Why would a saga author invent such an intricate and anatomically accurate method of execution if it wasn't based on real, albeit extremely rare, occurrences? These scholars suggest that while the stories were recorded later, they drew upon an oral tradition that captured the most brutal acts of familial vengeance. The lack of archaeological evidence is not surprising. A victim of the blood eagle would likely not have been afforded a formal burial. Their body would have been left to rot in the open as a deterrent. Even if buried, the marks of rib incisions would be difficult to distinguish from other post-mortem damage after a millennium in the ground. This perspective urges consideration of the culture of the time. The Viking world, where honor and reputation meant everything, and blood feuds could span generations. Sagas are replete with tales of spectacular, inventive, and cruel acts of retribution. Was the blood eagle truly more improbable than other documented atrocities of the era? Horror does not mean it didn't happen. Perhaps it was an exception, but not a fiction. This raises an important question. Why tell this specific story? What does it say about a culture capable of conceiving and believing in such a thing? The answer lies in the Norse worldview, the importance of honor, the duty of vengeance, and the terrifying nature of their gods. In the Viking Age, honor, heider, was the most valuable possession, defining one's social standing, reputation, and self-worth. Dishonor rendered a person a nidingur, an outcast. Insults, especially those against family, deeply wounded honor and demanded vengeance. The legal systems of the time, such as in the Icelandic Sagas or laws of the Grey Goose, provided procedures for addressing injuries and killings, often involving fines, vergild, or man price. However, for profound offenses, like the killing of a father by a rival king, paying a fine was seen as a sign of weakness. Honor demanded blood vengeance, a cycle of killings that could tear families apart for generations. Sagas, family histories, are driven by the mechanism of blood feud. The blood eagle represents the extreme end of a feud, a vengeance so total that it ends the cycle, leaving no room for a counter-response. How does one avenge an act intended to be the final word in cruelty? At the heart of this world of martial honor stood Odin, not a benevolent father figure, but a god of frenzy, treachery, poetry, and the dead. A god of war who valued victory at any cost. Known as the Terrible, the father of the slain, he demanded sacrifices. While large-scale human sacrifices were rare, ritual killings, especially of prisoners of war, are documented and supported by archaeological finds, such as the bog bodies of Northern Europe. These victims were dedicated to Odin in exchange for victory. In Thorfinn's story, Halfdan was dedicated to Odin. The blood eagle transforms from an act of revenge into an act of religious piety, the executioner offering the most extreme gift to the most demanding god. The victim is not merely killed, they are sacrificed, their body becoming a symbol worthy of a dark deity. A cultural foundation existed, a society obsessed with honor, driven by blood feuds, and worshipping a god who reveled in death and sacrifice. This was the soil in which the idea of the blood eagle, real or imagined, could take root. Despite all these considerations, a purely practical question remained unresolved. How realistic was it to carry out such an atrocity? Was the procedure, so vividly described in the sagas, anatomically possible? For a long time, it was widely believed to be impossible. It was thought that the shock alone would kill the victim long before their lungs could be extracted. This seemed nothing more than medical fantasy. Nevertheless, in 2022, a group of medical experts and historians from Keele University in England revisited the question, armed with modern anatomical knowledge and advanced modeling software. Their conclusion was truly chilling. The study indicated that, from a medical perspective, the procedure was entirely feasible. A person could remain alive, albeit in a state of unimaginable agony and shock, during the process of severing the ribs. The researchers concluded that death would occur very quickly once the lungs were exposed and the chest cavity collapsed, suggesting that the final image of fluttering wings is a poetic exaggeration. However, the core of the ritual, the carving, breaking of ribs, and extraction of lungs, could, according to their analysis, have been anatomically performed. This research is not proof that the blood eagle actually happened, but it removes the main argument against its possibility. It demonstrates that it was not physically impossible. Vikings, known for their masterful use of sharp blades and deep knowledge of animal anatomy, could well have possessed the grim skills to carry out such an execution. The study adds a new layer of plausibility to the sagas, suggesting that what we might easily dismiss as fantasy was, in fact, within the realm of terrifying reality. All this leads us to consider the scale and purpose of this ritual. If the blood eagle truly occurred, it was certainly not an everyday event. It is mentioned only a few times throughout the entirety of Norse literature. It was not a standard form of execution or legal punishment. Rather, it was an anomaly, an event of extreme rarity. But it was precisely in this rarity that its power lay. The strength of the blood eagle was not in its frequency of use, but in its symbolic meaning. It was a potent weapon of terror. In an age before mass communication, a leader's reputation was built on stories passed by word of mouth. A chieftain known to have performed the blood eagle would possess a terrifying aura. This story would spread among traders and warriors from fjord to fjord, carrying a message for any potential rival. This is what awaits anyone who dares to cross me. It was a form of psychological warfare designed to intimidate enemies into submission and instill awe and fear in followers. The very story of the blood eagle became a weapon of deterrence. The question of whether Ivar, the Boneless, actually performed this ritual on King Ella is, in some ways, secondary to the fact that he became renowned as a man capable of such brutality. The legend became his strategic advantage. By being associated with such an act of extreme, ritualized cruelty, a Viking leader could project an image of absolute and divinely sanctioned authority. It was a way to rise above the petty squabbles of lesser chieftains and become a figure shrouded in legend. All this touches upon what might be called the economy of reputation. In Viking society, wealth was measured not only in silver, land, and ships, but also in influence, loyalty, and renown. A strong reputation, or draghild, which can be translated as dragon slaying or great glory, was a currency more valuable than gold. It attracted the best warriors to your longship, secured advantageous alliances, and deterred attacks. How, then, could such a reputation be acquired? By performing great deeds, winning battles, exploring new lands, and, most importantly, by exacting memorable vengeance for one's kin. Investing in one's reputation might mean undertaking a perilous journey or commissioning a great poem from a skald to celebrate your victories. And for the most ambitious, it could mean orchestrating an act of vengeance so spectacular it would never be forgotten. The blood eagle, in this cold economic light, can be seen as the ultimate investment in a personal brand. It cost the life of one enemy, but resulted in a legacy of terror and respect that could pay dividends for years, ensuring the safety of your family and your lands. It was a brutal calculation where an act of supreme violence generated a wealth of political and social capital. So, what remains of the blood eagle? A literary myth, a factual, albeit rare, ritual? The answer, unfortunately, remains uncertain. The evidence is forever stuck in the gray area between gruesome story and plausible horror. But its legacy is undeniable. Over centuries, the blood eagle has detached itself from its complex historical context and transformed into a simple yet potent symbol of Viking savagery. Popular culture, from TV shows to video games, has enthusiastically seized upon this image. It is often presented without regard for historical debates or the cultural context of honor and religion. It is portrayed as a common practice, a routine move for any angry Viking, which it certainly was not. The blood eagle has become a cultural cliché, a quick and easy way to signal that Vikings were brutal. This satisfies our modern appetite for dark and violent stories, but at the same time, it reduces a complex culture to a caricature. The real story, with its layers of poetry, honor, religious fervor, and scholarly debate, is far more interesting than the monster myth it has become. Ultimately, the true horror associated with the blood eagle lies not in the literal question of whether a person's lungs were ever extracted through their back. The terror is rooted in the fact that human society proved capable of imagining such an atrocity. People conceived this torment, recorded it, and passed it down as a tale of righteous and heroic retribution. Regardless of whether the blood eagle is historical fact or a product of imagination, it offers us a unique glimpse into the minds of the ancient Norse, into a world where the lines between warrior, skald, and priest could be blurred, and where vengeance could be elevated to the status of a sacred ritual. The story of this brutal rite forces us to confront the profound darkness that can lurk within any human culture, hidden behind codes of honor and religious devotion. It serves as a stark reminder that the most terrible weapons are not always forged from metal. Sometimes they are shaped from ideas, from beliefs that allow people to view an act of extreme cruelty not as a crime, but as a sacred duty. Grasping this history, with all its brutal ambiguities, is not about simply condemning the past. It lies in recognizing the horrifying logic that can drive people to commit unthinkable atrocities, and in understanding that the capacity for such acts is an inherent part of human history that we ignore at our peril.